2021 was a year that, while largely devoid of the usual AAA heavyweights, certainly compensated via the abundance of AA and indie releases, with Rebel Inc being one of the many games to fill that gap. Developed and published by the team behind Plague Inc., which made quite the splash when it debuted back in 2014, it's certainly been a long time between the original game and this spin-off sequel. Rebel Inc shifts the gameplay away from curing diseases in favor of your more standard military-themed real-time strategy game formula. While Plague Inc technically has some RTS elements, these were very superficial at best, mainly revolving around a simplistic, almost mobile cookie-cutter-like mechanic of just clicking on these pop-up bubbles as quickly as possible whenever they appear, in order to advance your goals and ultimately win the game. Managing the symptoms and other characteristics of your disease, upgrading and downgrading various attributes over time, and otherwise incentivizing player flexibility under constantly changing circumstances was ultimately their core component in that game's design. While keeping an eye on the world map was somewhat important as a side objective in order to farm upgrade points and slow down the world's attempts to eradicate you, you didn't really have to worry about micromanaging anything on the world map. As long as you got to the end goal of wiping out mankind, it didn't really matter what strategies or tactics you employed along the way. A pinnacle example of the ends justifying the means. That said, if you're planning on carrying over that mindset to Rebel Inc., you're definitely going to be sorely disappointed indeed. Rebel Inc. is a very different kind of game in the sense that it completely shreds the mostly open sandbox approach of Plague Inc. in favor of enforcing a very particular series of very specific playstyles. You play as the benevolent dictator of a small third world country, as you attempt to repel a equally strong faction of rebels attempting a violent overthrow of your government, by basically burning and blowing up your cities, attacking your military forces in the name of justice, etc. Because of course, how else can peace and security be achieved if not by rampant violence and terrorism? Of course, I'm being rather flippant here, but sadly this is the US, so plenty of people on both sides have shown a lot of support for that kind of thing when it's their own side doing it. The game features a decent number of dictators for you to play as, a grand total of 8, each with their own unique playstyle, as well as their own advantages and disadvantages that will, at least in theory, greatly determine how you go about eliminating all opposition. This again, in theory, would be a good idea if not for the irritating fact that you have to grind to unlock each individual dictator in a linear fashion. In addition to picking your dictator, you also have these various advisors that you can pick to join your cabinet, and they each bring their own distinctive perks to the table, and each one has their own individual area of expertise. They're all sorted into 6 distinct categories, one type being one that benefits your domestic policies, like those involving rural or urban districts, while another type grants buffs to your military, while another type can assist you in creating and maintaining peace talks, etc. The list goes on. However, none of these are available to you at the start. Normally, if I was completely naive, I would say this bizarre, almost ass-backwards design philosophy of making the game easier and more interesting the 20th, 30th, and 40th time you play it, but making the first 10 or 15 times a complete bore, maybe it was just a poorly implemented form of replayability incentives. But the more rational and cynical side of me suspects the more practical reason was that this game was designed primarily for mobile rather than PC, and the unlocks were made this way to frustrate players into outright buying the advisors they want via their credit card rather than replay the game another 50 or 60 times until fortune eventually smiles upon them. If this game was free to play on all platforms, it would be an underhanded trick still, but one perhaps easily forgiven as the trade-off for the game, being free. However, since this is a paid game, such a maneuver would not be excusable. Once you get into the game though, every match will more or less play out exactly the same. You start off with almost nothing except a small amount of money, which you can spend on a variety of starter advancement programs, all having to do with your national infrastructure and domestic policies. Personally, during this early game period, I spent about half my money on improving my citizens' quality of life by providing them basic education, healthcare, and jobs, while conversely spending the other half on improving my national infrastructure, mainly through creating roads, highways, and other means of improving my transportation. Then and only then do I begin spending money on propaganda upgrades, because if you have no great or small achievements to boast to your people about, your propaganda outreach will be not as efficient as it otherwise could be. Because this game is fairly fast-paced, I usually find that around the time I start upgrading my propaganda, that's also when I have to start setting up my military forces in preparation for open conflict. The very second you close out of that pop-up alerting you to hostile rebel forces gathering in the area, you have to immediately begin the process of producing troops, because they will take a while to produce, which is why, luckily for you, they come in 2 basic varieties: coalition forces and your own military forces. During the middle portion of the game, you'll have to pretty much rely exclusively on coalition troops, since your own military forces will take far longer to produce, to the point where if you were to produce military troops first, the rebels probably would have swept through and seized control of basically half your country by the time you get your first battalion out the door. Luckily for you, the game removes this possibility entirely by making it so building coalition troops is a prerequisite for building your own military troops. I'm assuming this was designed the way it was exclusively to prevent the exact situation I just described. The problem with coalition troops, however, is that your citizens will absolutely hate them, and this will continually negatively impact your reputation over time, and will gain more sympathy for the rebels. This pisses me off in no uncertain terms because, again, instead of allowing the player to develop their own tactics, the game clearly has one and only one preferred playstyle if you ever want to win. The endgame in almost all cases involves you relinquishing your reliance on coalition troops in favor of only relying on your national military, as well as using drone aircraft to bomb the hell out of your enemies while engaging them on the ground with your own soldiers, in order to destabilize them before they gain solid footing in whatever region they happen to be in. Assuming you've completely upgraded your national road infrastructures, gotten rid of most, if not all, of your coalition troops, committed to at least half of the available social programs to improve your citizens' quality of life, and unlocked all the propaganda upgrades, you'd be very hard-pressed to ever lose. There is very little strategy involved, aside from just buying yourself time by combating individual skirmishes while you focus on spending your way to victory. Winning a war by spending more money than your opponent, now that's the American way. Ultimately, the game has two possible endings, the first being one you'll most likely get, and the other one statistically you'll probably never get, because it's honestly not worth the risk. The first ending being one where you negotiate a peace treaty with the nameless and faceless rebel leaders. The series of interactions is spread out via a linear succession of text-based pop-ups, all of which give you the same three basic generic responses, which are to, number one, effectively tell the rebels to go fuck themselves, and that you'll compromise not one bit. Number two, tell the rebels you will agree to a compromise, or number three, give the rebels basically everything they want on that single point. Doing the first option will cause the rebels to basically go insane, and will greatly multiply the frequency and aggressiveness of their ongoing attacks against your country. Doing the second option will result in little to no noticeable increase in violence from the rebels, but will cause your citizens' approval of you as a strong leader to drop somewhat. And doing the third option will have a severe negative impact on your reputation. This is important because if you deplete your reputation bar entirely, it's an instant game over. And odds are, once you get near the end of the game, your reputation will probably already have dropped quite a bit. I've had very few games where my reputation remains over 60% throughout. There's very few ways to actually raise it aside from telling the rebels to go screw themselves, and even that only provides a minimal boost, which is almost certainly offset by the amount of reputation that you'll then inevitably lose due to increased rebel hostility in certain regions. So generally speaking, as long as you have at least some dominant control over your country when entering into peace talks, you should be fine picking a mix of options 1 and 2, mostly 2. The second obvious end to the game is, of course, if you get all your citizens convinced you are the one true leader. Because similar to Plague Inc., once the numbers start rising, they almost never decrease and go in the opposite direction. Confusingly enough, unlike Plague Inc., Rebel Inc doesn't have any noticeable equivalent to the cure mechanic, where the opposing force attempts to directly reverse your progress. You're telling me that a militant rebel group with God knows how many weapons and sympathetic people at their disposal can't put together a few propaganda posters, TV spots, and radio addresses of their own? I mean, I get that this isn't the Hunger Games, but it feels like you're never actually combating an actual rebel faction. Instead, it just feels like you're fighting a small number of nameless and faceless psychopaths who have no clear aim or goal and are interested in nothing except killing as many of your people as possible with their bombs and guns. If I was the one in charge of fixing this game and making it stand apart as something different other than what came before, I would have dedicated my resources towards making my opposition as distinct and different from the character I'm playing as possible. If my benevolent dictator has their own advantages and disadvantages and was geared towards a certain playstyle, it makes sense if the rebel faction had its own leader with its own perks and vulnerabilities, forcing you to modify your playstyle in order to adapt to theirs. Allow them to unlock perks that give them their own unique advantages. It would create a more dynamic and interesting RTS gameplay flow. It's frankly not all that interesting to only interact with rebels via a small pop-up text screen, as if we're playing a virtual pen and paper RPG game. I would also make domination of the airwaves and other communication methods a more core component. Have both your dictator and the rebels fight to sway the majority of the population to their side through a mixture of force and misinformation. Lean into the intrigue a bit more, otherwise what's the point of adapting this theme if you're not going to do anything with it? Overall, Rebel Inc. is definitely not worth your time and money, I'm sorry to say. Instead of feeling like a proper sequel, one that expands upon and refines what was already there, it comes across as a rushed, standalone DLC similar to a year ago, when Plague Inc. added that new The Cure game mode, where instead of controlling a deadly viral disease, you play from the opposite perspective and attempt to cure one. The only difference is that Plague's Cure update, I believe, was free and didn't attempt to be anything more than what it was. A fun spin on the existing content. Rebel Inc., meanwhile, feels like one of those specialty Monopoly boards where everything might have been renamed, reorganized, and given a new coat of paint, but the DNA of the game is absolutely identical to the original. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect or hope that, in the course of more or less a decade, the developer might have learned to do more than just lazily copy-paste existing files and swap out the names. So instead of playing a game that desperately wants to be Plague Inc., my recommendation to you is that you just instead play Plague Inc. itself. It's a phenomenal casual game that I play myself in both PC and my mobile phone. You'll have way more fun destroying humanity with stupidly named viruses than you would have fighting generic, nameless, and faceless rebel factions in some obscure third world country here in Rebel Inc. On that note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. As ever, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button and comment below what you think of the game. Comments really help my videos get boosted in the algorithm, plus I read and respond to nearly all the comments I get, so if you just want to drop a comment to say hi or get my opinion on something even if it's unrelated, I'll be more than happy to talk with you down there. Likewise, subscribing and clicking the bell really does help. I know it's cliche, no one likes to hear it, but the YouTube algorithm is an ultimate pain in the ass for every creator to use, doubly so when you're a small channel like me. So every bit helps. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.